everyone, welcome back. Miss Curdy here, and today we are going to be doing lesson 13.5. So in 13.3, we are comparing fractions. We are saying which one was bigger by looking at fractions that had the same denominator. Then in 13.4, we are figuring out what fraction was bigger by looking at fractions that had the same numerator. Now, there are going to be times where we are comparing fractions, trying to figure out which fraction is larger, but the numerators and the denominators are both going to be different. So when that happens, what we need to do is we need to think about the size of each fraction. And in order to do that, we are going to be comparing them to benchmarks. So in order to compare fractions that have different numerators and different denominators, there's actually going to be several steps. So we want to reason about their size. And we're going to be thinking about if they are close to 0 or nothing, if they're close to the whole, or if they're close to 1/2. It's a lot like rounding. So let's look at some fractions for a moment here. So here I'm looking at fractions, and this line has been partitioned into eighths, and I know that 0 is also the equivalent fraction of 0/8, and over here my 8/8 is the equivalent fraction of 1 whole. So looking at some of these fractions, I can see that over here I've got fractions that are close to 1 whole. That 7/8 is pretty close, and that 6/8 is pretty close to being a whole. Down at this end, I see I've got 1/8 and 2/8. Those are close to being 0 because they're not far away from that number over there. And then in the middle here, I see that I've got 4/8, which is equivalent to 1/2 because 4 is half of 8. And over here, I've got fractions like 3/8 and 5/8 that are pretty close to being a half. 3/8 is a little bit less than a half. 5/8 is a little bit more than a half. And I can see that from the number line, but also thinking about 5 being only 1 away from that 4/8, and 3/8 only being 1 away from that 4/8. So if a fraction is close to 1/2, the numerator has to be close to half of the denominator. Half the denominator here would be 4 and 4, so I know that 3 and 5 are close. And then I also want to decide, is it going to be a little bit more than a half or a little bit less than a half? Let's take a look at these two fractions here, 5/12 and 8/14. So when I want to determine if it's close to a half, I know that when I have 5/12, I know that half of that would be 6/12. And 5/12 is a little bit less than 6/12, but still very close to a half. 8/14, I know that 7/14 would be exactly 1/2, and here I've got 8/14, so it's a little bit more than a half. This one was a little bit less, that one was a little bit more, but they're both very close to being half of that whole. Now, a fraction is close to 0 if our numerator is close to 0 of the pieces of the whole. So just like up here in this number line, 1/8 is only 1 piece away from being nothing. 2/8 is 2 pieces from being nothing, so those are relatively close to 0. Here I've got 1/7, and I know that 0 would be 0/7, so we're only 1 away from here. I know that 0/20 would be equivalent to 0, and 4/20 is only 4 away, so it's pretty close to being 0 pieces of the whole. When I look at 4/20 a little bit closer, I know that we are 4 pieces away from being 0. And then if I want to compare it to a half, which would be 10/20, I see that we are 6 pieces away from being a half. And therefore I know that is closer to being 0 than it is to being a half. And if I saw that on a number line, I would see the exact same thing. Now, a fraction is close to a half when it's close to about half of the pieces. It's close to 0 if it's close to 0 of the pieces of the whole. And a fraction is close to 1 whole when the numerator is almost all of the pieces, or it's almost the same as the denominator. So here are two fractions that are close to a whole. 7/8 because it's only 1 piece away from being 8/8, and 18/20 is only 2 pieces away from being 20/20. So again, when I'm going to start comparing these fractions, I first need to figure out what benchmark they are close to. Are they close to a half, 0, and a whole? And then if they are close to a half, is it a little bit more, or a little bit less. This is going to take some practicing. So here we've got several fractions down here, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at their size, we're going to look at the numerator and the denominator, and think, are they close to being 0, close to being 1 whole, or close to being a half? And the key to this is to first figure out what the half would be, and then are we a little bit less or a little bit more? Are we closer to 1 or closer to 0? So I'm going to walk us through the first couple. So here I have 3/4. First I want to think, well, what would a half be? And a half would be 2/4, which would be less than 3/4. And then I think about my whole now is 4/4, because 3/4 is right in the middle. I know that I'm going to round up and say that it's close to 1 whole. So 3/4 is going to go in that box, close to a whole. Here I'm thinking about 2/12. Well, I see that 2 is very small compared to that 12. So I'm thinking we're going to be close to 0. So when I look at that, I think, okay, well, what would 0 be? And that, of course, would be 0/12. And 2/12 is only 2 pieces away from that. But let's see what our next benchmark would be. Our next benchmark would be a half, which would be 6/12. And I know that I'm 4 away from being a half, telling me I'm closer to being 0. So we're going to put 2/12 in our close to 0 box. All right, 3/100. Well, just looking at this, I know if I only have 3 pieces out of 100, that's going to be pretty small. I'm only 3 away from being 0, and I know that a half would be 50/100, and I'm 47 away from being a half. So I know that 3/100 would also be close to 0. All right, let's take a look at the next one, 3/6. So I'm looking at that, and I'm thinking about how close it is to being a half. And I'm thinking, what is half of 6? And I know that 3 is half of 6. So that 3/6 is going to be exactly equal to 1/2. All right, let's go to 6/8. Now I can tell that it's more than a half because 4/8 would be a half, and then a whole would be 8/8. So now I want to think, how far am I away from a half? How far am I away from a whole? And I am 2 away from a half because 4 plus 2 is 6, and then I'm 2 away from being a whole. And whenever we're right in the middle, we want to round up, so 6/8 is going to be close to a whole. All right, take a moment to try 4/10 on your own, and then meet me back here to see how you did. Alrighty, I'm looking at 4/10, and I'm first thinking, well, what would a half be? And a half would be 5/10. And I see I'm only 1 away from that. And a 0 would, of course, be 0/10, and I am 4 away from that. So I know that I'm closer to 1/2, but I'm still, once I get to that point, I want to think, are we less than, equal, or more? We're not equal to, because a half would be 5/10. And we're not more than, because 4 is less than 5. So I know that we're going to be less than a half, because a half would be 5/10. We only have 4/10. All right, taking a look at 2/3. 3 is an odd number, so it doesn't have a perfect half for us to be working with. But I know that a 0 would be 0/3 and 3/3. I'm 2 away from 0 and only 1 away from a whole. So I know that 2/3 is going to be closer to a whole. All right, 13/15. I see that I'm only 2 pieces away from that whole. And again, 15 isn't a perfect, won't make us a perfect half, but I know it would probably be around 7. But looking at the fact that we're only 2 pieces away from that whole, I know that 13/15 will go in my whole. All right, go ahead and pause the video and try to figure out 9/14 on your own. Remember thinking about, is it close to a half, is it close to 0, or close to 1 whole? And then we'll meet back here to go over it. All right, looking at 9/14, I first think, what would a half be? And that would be 7/14. So I know that we are more than a half, but let's compare to that whole. So I see that 9/14 is only 2 away from being a whole, but it is 5 away from being a whole. So I can tell that it's going to be close to a half, And now when I look at it and compare it, I know that it is a little bit more than a half. So it's going to go in our more than section. All right, so that was only step one of comparing our fractions if they have different numerators and denominators. The first thing we'd have to do for both of those fractions we're looking at is decide is each one close to 0, a half, or a whole. So now let's get into the actual comparing part. So when we compare fractions, again, first to decide, are we close to 0, a half, or a whole? Let's look at these two fractions. 3/6 or 5/8, which one is going to be larger? So first, we have to go to the benchmarks. So down here, I'm noticing that 3/6 is close to a half. It's actually exactly 1/2 because 3 is half of 6. So I know 3/6 is 1/2. 5/8 is also close to a half, but it's a little bit more than half because 4/8 would be exactly 1/2. So now I see that this one is more than a half, this one's exactly a half. So comparing them, more than a half is going to be greater than exactly a half. So to compare them, I would say 3/6 is less than 5/8 because 5/8 is more than a half and 3/6 is equal to a half. All right, so let's try another comparison down here. So I'm looking at these two fractions. I want to know which one is bigger. In order to do that, I have to compare them to benchmarks because I've got different numerators and different denominators. When I'm looking at 2/6, I know that 2/6 is less than 3/6, which is a half. So 2/6 is less than a half. When I look at 3/4, I see that it is greater than a half because 2/4 would be a half. So if this fraction is less than a half, this one's more than a half. This has to be the greater fraction. So 3/4 is going to be greater than 2/6. More than a half, less than a half. All right, take a moment to pause the video and try this comparison on your own. Again, not just looking at the numerators and denominators, but thinking about the size. Use your benchmark 0, a half, and a whole, and then see if you can figure out what the comparison would be. All right, let's take a look at this. So I'm noticing that 1/6 is less than a half. And it's actually close to 0. And then I'm noticing over here that 7/8 is more than a half. It's actually close to 1/2. So if this is less than a half and this is more than a half, I know that 7/8 is going to be greater. 1/6 is less than 7/8. Alrighty. So that is a lot of work to compare these fractions. So remember, when you're going to compare fractions that have different numerators and different denominators, we want to think about their size and we want to use benchmarks. Are we close to being 0? Are we close to being a whole? Or are we close to a half? And are we a little bit more or a little bit less than that half? This is something that will take practice. Please sign up for a mini lesson with your teacher if you want to go through some more examples. And I'll see you back here for the next video. I hope you have a really great day. Bye.